Tuesday morning in Washington, D.C. felt just like any other at least on the surface. The sun broke gently through the tall windows of the Eisenhower Executive Office building, casting long, gold-tinted beams across shelves lined with leather-bound books. Vice President J.D. Vance adjusted his navy blue tie in the mirror, rehearsing answers in his head for CNN's morning politics segment. He looked calm, confident, maybe too confident. At just 42, Vance had climbed faster than most in American politics. Some called him a visionary. Others called him reckless. But no one could deny that when he spoke, people listened. Sometimes for the right reasons. Sometimes not so much. That same morning, thousands of miles away, in the heart of West Africa, the capital city of Ouagadougou hummed under a dusty winter sun. Inside the old French-built presidential palace, a very different kind of leader was wrapping up a Security Council meeting. President Ibrahim Traoré didn't wear a suit or polish his image for television. At 36, he was one of Africa's youngest heads of state, former soldier turned reformer. He spoke softly but firmly. He moved with the composure of someone raised on battlefields, not banquet halls. And while critics called him controversial, many citizens called him something else. Hope. His office was more practical than grand maps on the wall, files stacked high, and a single framed photograph of a village school. He had taken power in a moment of national crisis, promising dignity, security, and independence for a nation long overshadowed by outside influence. Some doubted him, some feared him, but no one ignored him. Neither man knew it yet, but they were about to collide. At exactly 9 a.m. Eastern Time, CNN's signature theme music played, and the live broadcast began. Vance settled into a sleek leather chair in the D.C. studio, nodding politely as host Margaret Chen welcomed viewers to their international segment. Her question was simple. Mr. Vice President, what's your take on the new generation of leaders emerging in West Africa, particularly President Traoré of Burkina Faso? It sounded routine, a softball question, but what came next would set the internet on fire. Vance leaned toward the mic, his smile sharpening just slightly. Look, he began, I respect what they're trying to do over there. But when you've got guys like Traoré, military uniforms and big speeches pretending they're experts on governance, it's hard not to chuckle. I mean, come on. Where'd he even study law? Some internet diploma mill? The studio was silent for half a beat. Then he laughed. That kind of laugh people remember not because it's funny, but because it cuts. Half a world away, in a modest presidential office in Ouagadougou, Traoré's communications advisor, Aminata Diallo, rushed in holding her phone. Mr. President, she said, voice shaking, you need to see this. She hit play. No commentary. Just Vance's words, already clipped and reposted online with captions in French, English, and Arabic. Within minutes, it had been shared thousands of times. President Traoré watched quietly. No anger in his eyes, just focus. He didn't flinch, didn't pace. But in that silence, something shifted. Meanwhile, in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of the capital, a retired professor turned off the volume on his old television. Mamadou Konate, 68, had taught constitutional law for over 4 decades. He cleaned his glasses slowly and turned to his wife. It seems, he said softly, this old teacher has one more lesson to give. And that's when the world began to change. The internet didn't just react, it exploded. Within an hour of Vice President Vance's CNN interview airing, his comments had been clipped, subtitled, reposted, remixed, and memed across every major platform. On Twitter now, X, the hashtags #VanceArrogance and #AfricaResponds were trending globally. TikTok creators were lip-syncing the clip, with mock reactions. Political YouTubers broke down the footage frame by frame. Instagram was flooded with side-by-side images of African universities and Vance's smirk captioned, "Whose ignorance is it really?" In Ouagadougou, The mood shifted from shock to fire. Social media in Burkina Faso lit up with indignation. University students at the University of Ouagadougou gathered on campus lawns, holding handwritten signs, "Our minds are not third world." Artists began painting murals of President Traoré beside African philosophers and revolutionaries. Radio hosts cancelled their usual playlists and aired open-call discussions on dignity, education, and identity. And in the presidential palace, President Traoré remained silent. Not because he had nothing to say, but because he was deciding how to say it. For the moment, all eyes turned to a different figure. In a modest brick home, tucked away in the older part of the capital, Professor Mamadou Konaté sat at his desk. Papers were scattered in every direction: old lectures, newspaper clippings, printouts of constitutional texts in English and French. His phone buzzed non-stop with messages from former students. One read simply, "Please speak. The world needs your voice." Konaté was no stranger to controversy, but this was different. He had spent decades building something fragile: faith in African scholarship. His students didn't just learn law, they learned how to ask why law exists. And now, one of his brightest students, President Ibrahim Traoré, had been publicly mocked not for failing but for daring to lead. The professor turned to his grandson, Karim, a computer science student home for break. "Karim," he said, tapping the desk gently, "how does one post a video to YouTube?" Karim stared at him, then broke into a grin. "You're serious?" Konaté nodded. "Very." Across the ocean, chaos brewed in Washington. Vance's team huddled in the West Wing, scrambling to draft a clarification statement. His chief of staff, Sarah Mitchell, paced in front of a whiteboard littered with phrases like cultural misunderstanding, respect for developing nations, and misquoted in context. Vance, however, wasn't helping. "I told the truth," he muttered. "Why should I walk it back?" President Harris, watching it all unfold from the Situation Room, wasn't amused. She'd already received angry phone calls from 2 African heads of state and 3 U.S. senators. "This isn't just a gaffe, JD," she said during an emergency call. "This is a diplomatic firestorm." But the real response wasn't coming from presidents or politicians. It was building quietly, powerfully from professors, students, and everyday citizens who had felt belittled too many times to stay silent. On Reddit, a thread titled "Top African Universities That Outrank Ivy League Schools in Innovation" reached the front page in hours. On Medium, African American scholars began writing personal essays titled "Why Vance's Words Hurt More Than He Knows." On WhatsApp, voice notes from teachers across Ghana, Nigeria, Senegal, and South Africa began circulating, many ending with the same phrase, "We are not what they say we are. We are more." And in a quiet room in Ouagadougou, Professor Konaté stared at the blinking red light on Karim's camera. He inhaled, he exhaled, and he began. "Mr. Vance," he said, "I must thank you. In 40 years of teaching, I've never had such a global audience for one lesson." The camera kept rolling, but the world was about to stop and listen. 12 hours after Vice President Vance's now infamous interview aired, the world waited for a response, not from the White House, not from press secretaries, but from the man at the center of the storm, President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso. And when it came, it didn't come with bluster. It didn't come in anger. It came in dignity. At 8 p.m. local time, national television in Burkina Faso interrupted its regular programming with a simple screen. Presidential address, live from Ouagadougou. At the same time, the official YouTube and Facebook pages of the presidency launched a live stream, complete with English subtitles. There sat Traoré in a military uniform, not behind a polished podium, but in a plain wooden chair, wearing a traditional cotton boubou, the kind his father once wore on market days. No flag behind him. No gold seal. Just a bookshelf. A clock ticking softly in the background. and the stillness of a leader who had chosen his words with care. He looked directly at the camera. "Mr. Vance," he began in French, "seems to confuse the value of education with the price of tuition." He paused, letting the silence speak. "I did not study in marble halls or ivy-covered campuses," he continued. "I studied law under mango trees, in classrooms where the lights sometimes flickered and the heat made our pens slip through our fingers. But in those rooms, we learned something powerful, that justice is not about where you studied, but how you serve." His words moved like water, gentle but unstoppable. "We are not asking for your approval," he said. "We are not seeking validation from former empires. We are building something new from the soil up, and no amount of sarcasm will uproot what we're planting." The live stream exploded. Viewers from across the continent tuned in, tagging each other, quoting his words, stitching reaction videos. In London, an anchor on BBC Africa was nearly speechless. "That," she said, "was a masterclass in restraint and leadership." On American late-night television, hosts joked that Vance had gone up against a soldier and got disarmed by a scholar. But this wasn't about jokes anymore. Something deeper was happening. By morning, the full transcript of Traoré's speech was being studied in classrooms from Johannesburg to Chicago. Professors of political science held emergency seminars. Commentators noted how, without once raising his voice, Traoré had reframed the entire narrative. He hadn't defended himself, he had elevated the conversation. Meanwhile, back in Burkina Faso, youth leaders began organizing events under the banner, "We speak for ourselves." These weren't protests, they were gatherings, storytelling nights, public readings of African philosophy, open mics where young people recited poems in French, English, Maure, Bambara. And all the while, President Traoré remained silent again. Not because he had nothing more to say, but because he knew what would happen next. Because halfway across town, in a modest study lit by natural light, a retired professor was still speaking into a camera, still recording a message that, unknowingly, would become one of the most powerful videos in modern political history. But before the world could hear that message, it first needed to understand something. That a man in traditional robes, sitting in a chair older than the internet, had just defeated arrogance without raising a finger. He had responded to mockery not with retaliation, but with truth. And truth, when spoken with grace, doesn't need to shout to shake the world. For nearly 2 days, Professor Mamadou Konaté hadn't left his study. Stacks of papers surrounded him, syllabi from old classes, handwritten notes in the margins of legal texts, aging copies of constitutions from around the world. He hadn't eaten much. He hadn't answered the phone. He was searching not just for the right words, but for the right tone. It wasn't anger he felt. It was something heavier. A sadness that came from watching ignorance parade as confidence on the global stage. His grandson, Karim, had set up a simple camera and microphone in the study. Natural light streamed through the wooden shutters, giving the room an almost sacred calm. "Are you ready, grandfather?" Karim asked gently. Professor Konaté nodded once. "Yes, let's begin." The first few takes were rough. The professor wasn't used to speaking to a lens. He stumbled, paused too long, corrected himself mid-sentence. But then something shifted, his voice steadied. His eyes focused, and the teacher in him took over. "Mr. Vance," he began softly, "I must thank you. In 4 decades of teaching, I have never had such a large audience for a single lesson." He smiled, but it wasn't smug. It was patient. The kind of smile worn by someone who knows he holds more than just knowledge. He holds perspective. "For years," he continued, "I taught students in rooms where the ceiling leaked when it rained. We had no projectors, no air conditioning, no laptops, but we had questions. We had curiosity. And we had discipline." His tone never rose, but his words carried the weight of a mountain. "One of those students," he said, reaching for a faded photograph beside him, "was a young man named Ibrahim. You know him now as President Traoré. He held the photo up to the camera, an old classroom shot from the 1990s. There, in the front row, sat a younger Traoré, eyes wide, hands folded on his desk. This young man, Konate said, stayed after class to debate with me. He asked questions no textbook could answer. And when he left my class, I knew I had been challenged to become a better teacher. The video wasn't flashy. It had no dramatic music, no high-definition graphics, but it didn't need any of that. The power was in the silence, in the pauses, in the space between the sentences. We studied your American Constitution, he said, but we also studied the Kurukan Fuga of the Mali Empyrean African Charter that spoke of human rights 600 years before your Declaration of Independence. The message was clear. Our knowledge is not your shadow. It is our own light. He continued, touching on philosophy, law, dignity, and the danger of assuming that where something comes from determines its worth. Education, he said, is not about marble columns or ivy-covered walls. It's about what we do with what we learn. It's about how we serve others. And Miss Vance, in that regard, your comments failed the very test of wisdom. The final line came not as a rebuke, but as a challenge. I invite you, Konate said, to a public debate. Any topic you wish: constitutional law, political philosophy, international relations. Let the world watch. Let the world decide whose education better serves humanity. The video ended. No music, no fade out. Just the professor, sitting in the stillness, as if he were still teaching to anyone willing to listen. Kareem uploaded it to YouTube under a simple title: A Teacher's Response to Vice President Vance, Professor Mamadou Konate. He didn't expect what would happen next. But the world was about to learn that sometimes the most powerful voice is the one that speaks last and speaks with grace. The video was 5 minutes long. No background music, no fancy lighting. Just the calm voice of an aging professor speaking into a webcam, surrounded by dusty books and wooden shelves. And yet, within 1 hour of being uploaded, it had over 100,000 views. By morning, that number had grown to 5 million. By lunch, it was trending globally. A Teacher's Response to Vice President Vance, Professor Mamadou Konate, was more than a viral video. It was a cultural earthquake. Clips of Konate's words, gentle but sharp, circulated across TikTok, Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube Shorts. Influencers, news anchors, and even celebrities were quoting his now iconic lines. Justice is not about where you studied, but how you serve. We studied law under leaking roofs, but our minds were never broken. Let the world judge whose education better serves humanity. Even Oprah Winfrey tweeted, "This is what dignity looks like." Professor Konate just gave us all a masterclass in grace and wisdom. In classrooms from Nairobi to New York, students replayed the video not just once, but multiple times, pausing, taking notes, applauding like they were in the room with him. But the impact didn't stop at admiration. It sparked action. In South Africa, professors launched a digital campaign, Honor Our Teachers, sharing stories of educators who shaped them under impossible conditions. In Nigeria, students organized a continent-wide virtual conference on decolonizing education. In the US, major news outlets scrambled to book Konate for interviews: CNN, PBS, even 60 Minutes. He declined them all. "I am not a celebrity," he told Kareem with a smile. "I am a teacher. I already said what needed to be said." Meanwhile, the political fire back in Washington was burning hot. J.D. Vance's office was in full meltdown. His communications team couldn't keep up with the fallout. Every time they released a statement, it was drowned out by yet another viral remix of the professor's video. Even his usual defenders were backing away. Ben Shapiro, who had tried to argue that Vance was simply being honest, faced backlash in his own comment sections. "Watch the professor's video before you talk," one viewer replied. "This isn't about politics, it's about respect." At Yale Law School, where Vance had once studied, the dean issued a public statement emphasizing that excellence in legal education exists in all corners of the world, not just in elite institutions. But the turning point came with a phone call. Judge James Henderson, Vance's longtime mentor, called him personally. "JD," he said, voice low and disappointed, "I taught you better than this. A real leader knows when to stop talking and start listening." For the first time since the controversy erupted, Vance sat still. In his study that night, he watched Professor Konate's video again. Not once, not twice, but 5 times. No one else in the room, just him. And the echo of his own arrogance ringing louder with each replay. Outside, the world had moved on from laughter to learning. Major universities in Europe and Asia began reaching out to the University of Ouagadougou. Offers poured in for educational partnerships, research exchanges, and scholarship programs. And all the while, Professor Konate returned to his quiet life. He still walked to the corner bakery every morning, still wore the same tan jacket he'd owned for years. But now, strangers stopped him in the street not to take selfies, but to say, "Thank you. Thank you for reminding us that sometimes the most powerful lesson is the one not taught in a classroom, but spoken from the heart." It was just past midnight in Washington when JD Vance finally made the decision. He couldn't sleep, not because of political pressure or media frenzy, or even the calls from his advisors. What kept him awake was the echo of a professor's calm voice saying things no one at Yale had ever dared to say. It wasn't rage he felt anymore, it was recognition. The following morning, instead of calling a press conference or staging a photo op, Vance did something unexpected. He went home. Literally. He left his office at the Eisenhower building and returned to his private study. A quiet room filled with family photos, personal books, and a worn wooden desk. It was the one place that didn't feel like theater. He set up a single camera. No suit, no flag, just a sweater and his natural voice. "Good evening," he began, looking directly into the lens. He paused, then exhaled. "I want to begin by addressing the people of Burkina Faso, President Ibrahim Traoré, and most of all, Professor Mamadou Konate." His voice was steady, but not rehearsed. "The video you released," he continued, "did something my expensive education often failed to do. It taught me humility. It wasn't a perfect apology. Some political polish still lingered around the edges, but it was real enough, honest enough, human enough. I made a comment that was dismissive, ignorant, and deeply disrespectful. And while I can't undo what I said, I can choose how I move forward. Today, I'm choosing to listen." Within minutes of uploading, the video began circulating, first on official US government channels, then on Twitter, then everywhere. People weren't expecting an apology, especially not from Vance. But here he was, publicly acknowledging the pain he caused and, more importantly, acknowledging his blind spots. Back in Ouagadougou, President Traoré was briefed on the video before dawn. He watched it alone. And when it ended, he didn't speak right away. He simply nodded, as if something had come full circle. Later that day, in a live press conference, Traoré addressed the world. "We accept Vice President Vance's apology," he said. "In the spirit of Ubuntu that I am, because we recognize that growth is possible for us all." He didn't gloat. He didn't posture. He reminded the world that the real divide wasn't between continents, it was between arrogance and humility. Then he made an announcement that surprised everyone. "Professor Mamadou Konate," he said, "will be awarded the National Order of Merit, nation's highest civilian honor, not for defending me, but for defending the dignity of education." The room erupted in applause. But the ripples didn't stop there. In a move that no one could have predicted, Harvard Law School reached out to Professor Konate, inviting him to deliver a global lecture series on comparative constitutional law. Several other universities followed suit. But the professor, true to form, set one condition. The lectures must be broadcast freely, he said, to universities across Africa. Knowledge should not be gated by wealth. It should flow in all directions. It was a moment that transformed what had begun as an insult into an international reimagining of education, dignity, and dialogue. And as the dust of controversy began to settle, something new was rising in its place. Not just apologies, not just recognition, but a quiet, powerful shift. The kind of shift that doesn't make headlines, but changes history. One voice. One video. 6 months had passed since the viral storm. The headlines had moved on, as they always do. But the impact of that moment, the professor's video, the apology, the dialogue it sparked had taken root in places far from the cameras. In Washington, J.D. Vance had changed. Not drastically, not theatrically, but noticeably. He read more. He asked better questions. His speeches on foreign policy now included quotes from African philosophers and references to historical events beyond the Western lens. At a private lunch with President Harris, he confessed, "The professor did me a favor. He held up a mirror and I didn't like what I saw, but it made me better." He even began learning French. "I want to read Traoré's speeches without translation," he joked. "It's time I listen properly." Meanwhile, in Burkina Faso, Professor Mamadou Konaté returned to his classroom. His once modest university office now had fiber-optic internet, a high-end camera, and a calendar full of virtual guest lectures with students from 4 continents. But he remained the same. No title upgrades. No security detail. No publicist. Every class began with the same words. "I am here to learn as much as to teach." Students from Boston to Bamako tuned in, not just for legal analysis, but to hear from the man who had once silenced arrogance with truth. And he wasn't the only one changing lives. President Traoré had used the global attention to push forward his boldest initiative yet, the Continental Leadership Institute, a Pan-African program designed to train the next generation of leaders grounded in integrity, humility, and historical awareness. Its first class included students from every African nation: young lawyers, engineers, activists, educators. Some had never been on an airplane before. Others had grown up in conflict zones. But they all arrived with a shared purpose: to learn how to lead with dignity. In his opening remarks at the Institute, Traoré didn't talk about Vance. He didn't need to. Instead, he said this: "This institute is not a reaction. It is a declaration. We will define our leadership by how we serve and not by how we are perceived." The announcement caught the attention of global donors, educational NGOs, and even private foundations in the US. The African Development Bank pledged long-term funding. The Gates Foundation offered grants for digital expansion. UNESCO signed on as a partner. What began as a diplomatic embarrassment had become a movement that stretched beyond borders, beyond egos. In American schools, new curriculum pilots emerged around the idea of global humility, the principle that learning isn't about dominance, but dialogue. A few high schools even included Professor Konaté's video in their ethics classes, using it to spark discussion about bias, power, and listening across cultures. And while many expected J.D. Vance and Professor Konaté to meet in person, they never did. Not because of resentment, but because Konaté politely declined every invitation to Washington. "Let us each do the work where we are needed," he wrote in a private letter. Still, the two men continued writing each other. Their letters, kept confidential, formed a quiet bond built not on agreement, but on understanding. In Vance's final message, he wrote, "You were right, Professor. The best education is the one that teaches us how much we still have to learn." Konaté's reply was just one sentence: "Now you are ready to be a true student of the world." And so, the story didn't end with applause or headlines. It ended in classrooms, in small conversations, in the quiet turning of pages. Proof that, sometimes, The loudest lesson comes not from the powerful, but from the wise.